everyone, welcome back, and today we have a very special guest for you. His name is Gene Baur. Gene Baur is president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary, America's premier farm animal sanctuary and advocacy organization. Hailed as the conscience of the food movement by Time magazine for more than 30 years, Gene has traveled extensively around the country, campaigning to raise the awareness about the abuses of industrialized factory farming and our current food system. Credited with initiating passage of the first U.S. laws to prohibit cruel farming confinement methods, winning the first ever cruelty conviction at a U.S. stockyard, and inspiring an international farm sanctuary movement. He is the author of two national best-selling books, the first being Farm Sanctuary, Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food, and the second being Living the Farm Sanctuary Life, the ultimate guide to eating mindfully, living longer, and feeling better every day. Without further ado, let's listen in on that conversation. Gene Baur, welcome to the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour.
It's great to be with you.
And so my co-host, as you see, who is this random person on the other screen, his name is also Gene Mishner. Gene, do you want to do a brief introduction for Gene Baur?
Sure.
A lot of Genes.
This could get really confusing because I've never spoken to another Gene before. Yeah, we'll see how it plays out. But firstly, I just wanted to say it's a huge privilege to be able to speak to you today. So I really want to say that I appreciate you giving your time. Just for background, I work in a financial role for a tech company. We aim to remove paper from the office. So making a paperless reality happen is what we aim to do. The crossover is I've been vegan for about 6 years, so about 2014. And I've always seen your name come up in various places, particularly Facebook and friendship groups. So yeah, it's been a long time coming. So it's real pleasure to meet the other Gene.
Yes, no, there aren't that many Genes out there. It's true.
Yeah, I know, but Gene Baur, you managed to find all the genes in the world, though. I saw that you co-authored a book with Gene Stone.
That's right. And that was another thing when we first met. It was like, your name's Gene, my name's Gene, because again, it's a pretty, it's not a name that you see many people with.
Mm-hmm, yeah, exactly. So if you're ready, we're going to jump on the topic of vegan. I know that's a big part of your identity. And so our first question is rather, the word provocative comes to mind, but I don't think it's all that appropriate. So is there a wrong reason to be vegan in your mind?
I don't think there's a wrong reason to be vegan. For me, being vegan is aspiring to live as kindly as possible. And I think most people would rather live with kindness to other animals and also, frankly, with other people. If you think about what happens in slaughterhouses, to me, being vegan is an aspiration to live as kindly as possible. I think most people, feel that that's not a bad idea.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Along the same theme, how do you maintain your vegan diet while also being accommodating to your friends and family? What do you do when you know you'll be going to social functions and where there will be little to no vegan food? And that one vegan dish that you bring, if it's a potluck, will be eaten by everyone else as well. Growing up, I always experienced this with my parents because they've been vegetarians for over 40 years.
Yeah, well, for me as a vegan, as you say, oftentimes when you go to social functions, there's not a lot of vegan food, or there might not be any vegan food there. So you just have to plan and ideally be able to bring a very tasty vegan dish, because part of the benefit of going to these events as a vegan is that you can demonstrate that vegan food is tasty and that people are not going to be missing anything if they try vegan food. So it's a good idea to bring a lot of it because, as you say, other people are going to be eating that food, the vegan food, and you're not going to be eating their food. So it's just a matter of planning, sometimes eating a little bit before you go just to make sure that you're not hungry, but planning. And I think it just indicates that being vegan is not normalized the way it other things are. And I look at those as opportunities to hopefully raise awareness. I'm a big fan of vegan integration versus vegan segregation. Some folks say, I don't want to be where there's meat. And I do understand that. But I think that there's a big benefit in vegans interacting with people who are not vegan to be able to help educate and show that vegan food can be very tasty.
Yeah, that takes a very patient person, right? Because you got to educate everywhere and all the time.
Well, I mean, I've done this work since the 1980s, and early on, I probably had more of an edge, and I was a little bit more kind of pushy. And I still have the same beliefs, but I think tactically being too pushy tends to push people away and to put up walls. And really the goal is to build bridges, to build connections. And so one of my huge goals now is, and I think it's an approach that works, is to find common ground and build from there. Instead of looking at where there are areas of disagreement and focusing on those and making them bigger and bigger and bigger, focusing on the areas of agreement and building from there and making those bigger and bigger and bigger. And for me, again, being vegan, as I said, is about living as kindly as possible.
Exactly.
I might use that as a good segue to remind the audience that the purpose of our show is to show the intersections of disability with other important ideas. Today we'll be focused on climate change, disability, and veganism, how they interact and how they're related. And probably it's a good time to also share the difference between being vegan and eating a plant-based diet. So we've so far been talking about food, but it's now going into the realm of other things. So climate change or other choices that impact the environment. So basically the distinction between those two things is that vegans adopt a plant-based diet, but they also choose to not use animal products for anything else, or animal materials such as like I'm wearing a cotton jacket instead of a wool jacket, and say non-leather shoes, that type of thing. So that's just an important distinction just for our viewing audience who might not have strayed into this area before.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jean Mishner. So the next question, I know you've covered this a couple times, Jean Bao. I'm still not clear what your views are on this, despite hearing your responses from other outlets. What are your views on cultured meat? Are they better than eating, farm animals, other kinds of animals in the wild?
Yes, I think that cultured meat is definitely better than slaughtering animals for food. It's a technology that is still developing, and I think in some instances there are things to work out. So I am very happy with the fact that there are veggie burgers already available that are made with plants. So I'm an enthusiastic advocate of those types of substitutes for animal products that exist now. And I'm glad that there are even fast food restaurants that are serving plant-based burgers instead of meat burgers. And the cellular technology that is being worked on, I'm certainly supportive of, but I'm also pragmatic in terms of what is working right now. And in a bigger sense, I think there's the question of what should we really be eating? And I think that eating a whole food plant-based diet is probably better than eating meat type foods. So I think there's the health aspect that is not necessarily best served by eating lots of veggie burgers. I think sometimes they're good. I think if we can take a fast food restaurant and substitute a meat burger for a plant-based burger, that's a very big positive step. But fundamentally, do we even want to have fast food restaurants is a bigger question. And what kind of a food system do we ultimately want? And so I'm supportive of incremental steps to prevent suffering in the existing food system, while also looking at ways to create a food system that is more holistic and healthier for workers. I mean, fast food workers aren't necessarily treated all that well, for example. To create a food system that really does address broader systems of oppression And so that's a big discussion. And I'm not sure how these plant-based meat products exactly play into it. I think there's certainly positive steps, but what I get very excited about is the idea of farmers markets, urban agriculture, community supported agriculture, community gardens, urban farming, where you are providing access to food, especially in communities where there's not been historically access to healthy whole plant foods. So, and then you're also creating opportunities for jobs and entrepreneurism. So I see those as like the ideal, while also recognizing that there are a variety of other approaches to addressing problems right now. And that's why I'm a big fan of, again, the veggie burgers in fast food restaurants, but also thinking bigger about the future and what it could look like.
Yeah, thank you for that. So moving on to farm sanctuary and your animal advocacy work, I'm sure you get a barrage of requests to rescue animals. How do you filter and decide who to help and who not to help, whether they be individuals, organizations, or animals, etc., as it relates to your animal rights advocacy? Because I know your sanctuaries only can accommodate so many.
Yes, we have been rescuing animals since 1986, when we first found Hilda, who was a sheep who had been discarded on a pile of dead animals behind a stockyard. And we currently care for about 1,000 animals between our sanctuaries in New York, in California. But it's impossible to rescue ourselves out of this problem of industrial animal agriculture. Even if we rescued 1 million animals every year, it would be a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of animals who are slaughtered. So, your question about which animals can you help and which can you not help is a very difficult one, because really all these animals deserve to be protected. And we cannot rescue and protect the billions of animals. So what we try to do is help those who we can, and also be able to tell their stories in a compelling way, so that those rescues can also help to educate people about the factory farming system. So we try to, focus on rescues as much as possible that will have resonance and be able to reach wider populations. So in many cases, for instance, we've been able to rescue animals who've escaped from slaughterhouses in cities like New York City. And these animals oftentimes garner public attention when you have a cow running through the streets, for example, and the local media covers the story, and citizens start hoping that this animal is going to be able to live out their life. So this is, again, part of this principle of finding common ground and building from there, right? So you have the mainstream population who regularly eats animals, and then there's a situation where they're rooting for a certain animal to live who they would otherwise be eating. And so we want to be able to help in those cases and be able to tell those stories over time, so that citizens start to see farm animals as living, feeling creatures, as somebody, not something, as friends, not food, as companions, not commodities.
Despite that overwhelming reality, I think it's great that you've been such a positive influence and not only creating sanctuaries yourself, but also influencing others to do the same. I know you were on the Jon Stewart show, and he has his own sanctuary with his wife, Tracy. So the next question is, how can governments give more subsidies to plant-based farmers to balance the subsidies given to meat industry farmers?
I think that's a really important issue. And fundamentally, we need to change our food system. And one reason that the food system is the way it is now is because every year, billions of dollars are spent by the US Department of Agriculture and by our federal government, as well as by state governments, that support animal agriculture. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago looking at subsidies to the dairy industry. And what they found was that 73% of dairy industry income came from government programs. Now that's just not a sustainable model. And so, but it's one that's developed over years, and animal agriculture is deeply entrenched in Washington, DC. There's a revolving door between, politicians who are there voting on laws and then they go and work for the industry, or they're working for the industry and they go into Congress and they start supporting industry's ideas. And one of the challenges with our political process is that when you have legislation that addresses agriculture, it goes to the Agriculture Committee in the House or the Senate. And the Agriculture Committee is made up of lawmakers who are very sympathetic to agribusiness. Many of them are farmers or represent farming districts and interests. So they tend to enact policies to get votes to support certain interests. And oftentimes these are the meat people who are lobbying and routinely in touch with them. So what ultimately I think has to happen is that the plant-based movement needs to become more politically active. And there are a few organizations now starting to do this. There's the Plant-Based Foods Association, for example, that is a trade association that represents plant-based businesses. There's the Good Food Institute that is working on policies to promote alternatives to animal products. And so there are organizations like those that can also ultimately partner with certain grain groups or produce groups and start building political machinery in Washington, D.C. to advocate for subsidies away from animal agriculture towards plant-based. And this could involve research support for cellular meat, for example, or for new types of plant-based business opportunities, and also startup funding for new farmers to go into these plant-based businesses. So we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, the system's been constructed a certain way that's going to take some time to shift. But I'm actually hopeful that in light of the coronavirus pandemic and the sort of money that's being spent by our government, that there can be a critical evaluation of what makes sense and to not continue doing the same thing that's been very expensive and very wasteful and very unhealthy. And I hope that increasingly there will be a serious discussion about how do we feed ourselves in the most efficient, healthful, just way. And that means shifting, I believe, to a whole foods, plant-based, a diversified food system where you have community-oriented farms, you have urban farms, you even have suburban farms where there's a food not lawns movement, where instead of having lawns that are mowed every week and fertilized, grow vegetables, and gardeners who, some homeowners are paying to come mow their lawn could be gardening and growing produce. And the homeowner gets a box of produce each week, and then you produce more than you need. So you start sharing it with your neighbors. Then your neighbors start growing it. And then somebody has apples, or then you have trees also in some cases. So one neighbor has apples, another neighbor has peaches, and you start swapping, and it creates this whole new movement, a whole different kind of food system. So it could be urban, it could be suburban, it could be rural. And also I think that farmers markets and other distribution methods like that connect farmers more directly to consumers are very positive.
Mm-hmm. And is that also a reason why you're closer to Washington, D.C.? I know you live in Arlington. I'm actually in the district. I'm actually right by the Hart Building.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah, right near the Senate there. Yeah. I'm here in the DC area partly to be able to weigh in on discussions in Washington, DC, and also partly because it's just a lot easier to travel from here than from Watkins Glen, New York, where I lived for many years in upstate New York. It's a beautiful area, but it's pretty remote. So being in DC has a number of benefits. And while we're on the topic of DC, there's also this bill by Cory Booker, the Farm Systems Reform Act, which I think is an example of the type of legislation that will help start moving things in the right direction, away from these industrial factory farm models towards a more diversified, community-oriented model. It's not completely plant-based, but it's part of the systemic reform I think we need to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And next, Jean Mishner.
Yeah, so we're going to switch into the disability discussion. So my question is, in your work, in your experience fighting for animal rights and other causes, have you seen disabilities in the community that are, have you seen that maybe hindering their path to becoming an activist?
there has not been enough interfacing between the vegan animal movement and the disability movement or other human rights movements. And I think that there's enormous opportunity for that to occur because, ultimately these things are aligned. Aspiring to live kindly, goes across the board, across species, living with other people and other animals in a respectful way where the dignity of each individual is honored and supported, cuts across lines, species lines and otherwise. So I think that there's an awful lot of work that can be done to bring these movements closer together. And at Farm Sanctuary, we are increasing our commitment to social justice. We have somebody who's been working on social justice with the organization for a number of years, but we're going to be increasing our investment in that space. So, at the end of the day, my belief is that being vegan and eating plants instead of animals, living with other animals in a compassionate way, doesn't only benefit the animals, but it benefits human beings. When we're eating plant foods that are healthy, our immune systems tend to be stronger than if we're eating animal foods and other processed foods that are, harmful to us. And when we're treating other animals with compassion, it also, I think, builds up our empathy. And that is a very important part of our humanity. Whereas if we're exploiting other animals and slaughtering them, that tends to undermine our empathy. And it causes us to start, in some instances, denigrating other animals who are abusing. And if you think about it, we do this sort of habitually without understanding or thinking much about it.
Definitely. It actually brings to mind, I know a lot of the rescued animals that come to the farm may have an injury, and I remember seeing a number of different animals with something like a wheel assisted mobility type thing attached to the hind legs or that type of thing. And I'm just thinking, there might be some parallels where people can relate to, how you can get through an injury, how you can improve. You can see that in an animal that's been rescued. And then I know a lot of your talks, you show like when you've rescued an animal, maybe even 20 years ago, and then seeing them watch them grow up to be a really, really strong, heavy, cow that's, 200 kilograms or whatever, completely different to when it first came in. So it's great to see those stories with a little bit of help from people in the sanctuaries.
Yes, no, those stories are so inspiring, and watching these animals heal is also good for us, and our first rescued animal, Hilda, was a sheep who was too sick to walk, who was left on a pile of dead animals, right? And watching her begin to stand and enjoy life was something that was very inspiring to us, and watching healing heals everybody involved, right? So and treating others with kindness is good for everybody involved, right? So these things are all totally connected, and that's really what the sanctuary is about. And different animals are able to begin walking and having mobility, others aren't, and then we continue doing what we can to support them.
I know Ming does a lot of research into how to improve wheelchairs as well, so there might be a little bit of a crossover. You can tip to the people making those mobility devices for injured animals as well.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, we can all learn from each other, right? Yes.
Yeah. Gee, you never know. Maybe we'll go into business together.
Yeah, you never know, right? It's really about living well. And, all of us have, challenges, and it's working through those challenges. And oftentimes it means working with other folks and having help from other folks who have strengths in some areas. And, we all have strengths in some areas and weaknesses in some areas. So it's really about putting these things together and playing to our strengths and getting support for the weaknesses whenever we need to, which can sometimes ultimately become strengths, when you work through something.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So as Jean Mishner was referring to earlier, to point out the intersectionality, even though we're covering intersectional topics, which is why you're on the podcast show, intersectionality between environmental issues and disability. So the next series of questions are especially relevant because they're the core of the existence of of this series, which is trying to bridge the gap between different issues and including people with disabilities in the different conversations of the urgent issues that are going on in today's world. And one of them being obviously environmental issues, climate change, global warming, whatnot. So the following questions are regarding that, and I know that you may not necessarily be an expert in the area, but it is prompting a series of thoughts and questions that would help you better include people with disabilities in the conversation, because after all, people with disabilities are 15% of the world's population, which is around 1 billion people, and that's a pretty big number. So moving on, what do you say to those who believe being vegan is for the elites, the wealthy, and the people who have time on their hands, and not for the struggling middle to lower class socioeconomic groups? So as you may know, people with disabilities in the US, around 70% of them are unemployed. So how can we live more compassionately through eating a plant-based diet, even with minimal monetary resources?
Yes, well, unfortunately, the vegan lifestyle has oftentimes been seen as elite. And in some cases, there's some legitimacy to that point. And sometimes vegan foods tend to be more expensive than other foods. And it's similar to how organic foods are more expensive than other foods, which sometimes reflects the production costs, but oftentimes it reflects the marketing opportunities that retailers have. And if they can sell an apple for $5 instead of $2, they'll do it because it's more profitable. And so a large part of the reason that vegan food is so expensive, I believe, has to do more with demand and consumer perception and marketing opportunists than with the real production costs. And the bottom line is that producing plants for consumption is inherently more efficient than raising animals for food. In the US, for example, 10 times more land is used for animal agriculture versus plant-based agriculture. So you need less land, you need less resources, and when you have a diversified food system like with urban farms or suburban farms or rural farms, you then have opportunities for people who live in urban or suburban or rural areas to potentially have jobs. And some of these jobs might be in food production, and I think that that is one form of agriculture. And I believe that these more diversified small farms, that the labor would be less sort of backbreaking than you see on these large farms, whether they're factory farms raising animals or even farms like raising lettuce, for example, in Arizona, where you have people working very hard. And I would argue that those workers are exploited. So this different food system, I think, could create all sorts of opportunities for workers in urban, suburban, and rural areas in production, but also potentially in packaging, harvesting and in value adding, maybe in baking or creating something out of these products that is added value, or in marketing through, technology and online. So I think that a new food system could have enormous new job opportunities, as well as providing food that is affordable and accessible to wider populations.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is less complicated. This one is, so have you made efforts to make your farm sanctuaries accessible to diverse communities, such as people with disabilities? If yes, how? If not, would you be open to making your sanctuaries as accessible to as many people as possible?
Well, I mean, we have taken some steps. We have ramps, for example, and our bathrooms are accessible, but there is more that I think we need to do. We're actually updating our website right now, and there are ways to make that more accessible. So we're actively now trying to be more inclusive in our approach. So it's a work in progress. And as you say, at a farm, it can be a little bit more challenging when you have, gravel roads with, drainage and ruts in them. Sometimes it's not as smooth for a wheelchair, but in some cases we might be able to provide assistance with a vehicle. And we do that sometimes now. It might be that we would do that more frequently in the future. But these are areas that we are seriously working on and focusing on as part of our social justice lens and our goal of being inclusive and also, again, diverse. You know, I think the idea of having different perspectives and different lived experiences is very valuable for the vegan movement and really for any movement that's trying to create a kinder world. So we have taken some steps. We're in the process of taking more steps, and this is going to be an ongoing process.
So say if I was to come visit in my manual wheelchair, would that be a possibility?
Absolutely, yes. We have our farm in Watkins Glen, New York. We have our farm in Acton, California, and you could visit either or both.
And they're wheelchair accessible?
The one in Acton is, I'd say, more accessible because it's smaller. The one in Watkins Glen is accessible around the visitor area. Going up around the farm, there are some areas that are, you know, harder to get to. So we would have to work through how that could occur. But they are accessible, but not as accessible as they could be.
Mm-hmm. So I know you offer cabins for people to stay in your New York farm sanctuary. Is it wheelchair accessible and usable to people who may have other types of disabilities? This is specifically addressing the cabins.
Yes, the cabins, one of the cabins has a ramp specifically in order to be accessible, but it's also possible that it could be made, you know, better. And, you know, so yes, and there's still work that we can do. And the other part about visiting farm sanctuary is that when people enter the sanctuary, and this is all people entering the sanctuary, there's a sign that says, "You're now entering the animal sanctuary. Please remember that you're a guest in their home." So that's part of, you know, understanding that these are other creatures and that they have their own experiences, that they have their own traumas, and that we need to enter with gentleness and respect, right? So that's sort of a part of the ethic at Farm Sanctuary too. But and that sort of is indicated a little bit in the pictures behind Jean there. But no, it's really an ethic, and it's, for me, again, being vegan is an aspiration to live as kindly as possible, kind of acknowledging that we are works in progress, you know, but we need to not use that as an excuse not to do better, but to recognize that, you know, there's going to be incremental steps and that we need to push ourselves constantly, but it's a process.
Yeah, so the next series of questions are climate change questions, and Jean Mishner is going to actually take over for a bit.
Yeah, sure. Actually, just to round off, what happened in Melbourne today was we were told we're going to go through another 6 weeks of lockdown. So yeah, it really is hitting home, and we are feeling exactly like the people in this photo, where yeah, it's just unbelievable. But you know, compared to a zoo, like, this is nothing. I can still go to the shops and buy my food. I just can't go visit my friends. So
yeah, that's Melbourne, Australia. Sorry, Jean Baur didn't let you know there.
Yeah.
Okay, so onto the climate change related topic. So actually, this was a little political. So in light of how face masks have been politically weaponized in the fight against COVID-19, particularly in the United States, how can the animal rights movement and food movement keep clear of also being weaponized?
You know, I think that it's very important for us to really talk about principles and to adhere to principles, you know, as opposed to getting into personalities and partisanship. And, you know, being vegan is partly an identity, but when that gets tied to ego, that also then gets tied to kind of ideas of power, which are, in my view, not healthy. So I think really talking about principles. And when it comes to the climate issue, I think we all have the same basic interest in living on the planet that's not being destroyed. And when we look at the reality behind animal agriculture, we recognize that it's one of the top contributors to the most significant environmental problems on our planet, including the climate crisis. So I think we just need to keep hammering principles. And ideally, there would be people from across the political spectrum who would come to find common ground and agree that there are concrete things that we can do as a species to live in a way that is less harmful on the planet, that is going to enable ourselves to live better lives while also helping other animals to live better lives. You know, it's a win-win-win across the board. So I think trying to frame these issues, you know, in terms of common ground, it's something that we all will benefit from, is a very important way to address these issues. And unfortunately, sometimes things become very politicized, but we just need to keep coming back to the principle of living with compassion, living in a way that is responsible. And I actually believe that many progressive policies in some ways are born of conservative values, like responsibility, for example, right? Look, let's live responsibly. And that means not causing unnecessary harm to others, not causing unnecessary harm to the planet. Respecting others is part of responsibility, right? So there's, of course, different ways that different politicians might interpret that. But if we start really zeroing in on the principles of respect, compassion, and then ultimately holding people, including politicians, accountable for those principles, I think that's how we move things forward.
I really like the example of that common ground piece. I know we tend to hang out and interact with people with the same thoughts and or just the same type of taste in food, and it can be less integrated, and you don't get to have that common ground. So it's a really practical way to start, I guess.
Yes, yes, and what it does too is it builds a bridge, and it builds sort of a connection and a level of trust, as opposed to focusing on an area where there's a disagreement, and then that does the opposite. And as you say, we tend to kind of each move in our own little bubbles, and be exposed to and talk to people who validate our own opinions, and that can be fine. But also, if everybody's thinking the same way, then nobody's really thinking, is what Benjamin Franklin said, right? So it's very valuable to be in conversation with people with different perspectives, and to try to do that in a respectful, open-minded way.
Definitely. Actually, another topic that maybe comes to mind that we can share a common ground on, really successful startup companies in the media. Recent ones being Tesla for making electric cars, and also Beyond Meat for the introduction of plant-based meat alternatives to different outlets, such as fast food, but other places as well. So with that in mind, what other things are required by our society and our governments to produce significant results to fight climate change?
Well, I think that Beyond Meat, for example, is playing a very important role, along with other companies who are providing meat type products, plant-based meats, to replace animal meats, which are enormously harmful to the planet. So I think that's a very concrete, fairly quick way to address immediate problems. I think more of that needs to continue happening. But I also think ultimately we need to look at the system more fundamentally, and ideally going to, again, a localized food system where, local food is your backyard, and you have like a neighborhood where we have suburban or urban farms, and people are walking to the neighbor to get food instead of driving even to the supermarket, where food has come from all sorts of different places, right? So I don't know what that ultimately looks like, but in my mind, that is sort of the ideal scenario. It lessens transport, it lessens stress on the planet, it lessens our need for energy, and the kind of systems that are currently in place. I mean, with coronavirus and restrictions in travel, we're already seeing the air get cleaner, and it's really amazing to watch some of these disruptions and to ask ourselves, I think, what does that mean? And there's also been an increasing interest in growing gardens, which I think is a beautiful thing. During World War II in the United States, victory gardens provided 40% of our nation's produce. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually grow food in a different way. And I think that it's much more energy efficient, as opposed to these, long distance transport efforts, but also industrial models where you have petrochemical fertilizers that are routinely used. Food waste, could go into the garden instead of going to a landfill. So I think these localized systems are very exciting to think about and then to develop them. And these are actually not new. This is how humans have lived for hundreds of years. And more recently, with wealth and with power and with access to fossil fuels and things like this, we've developed different systems, and now we've become dependent on them. And I think maybe with this coronavirus disruption, we can reflect and ask ourselves, does it make sense to continue on this path we've been on? Or perhaps can we revisit some systems and structures that made more sense? And instead of sitting in front of the TV, we can go out in the garden. That's a healthy thing, right? It's a much healthier human activity.
Yeah, and with 2020 is just a year of change, so it is showing us that we are capable of doing these things. So we'll hopefully see what happens at the end of the year.
I know what I personally want to know is, how have you been able to stay humble and focus on your mission over the years as you became, more famous and stretched thin in all the different directions, both personally and professionally, as one does when they become more well-known by the broader public?
Well, I have seen, unfortunately, firsthand the effects of power on people. And I think that it is one of the most corrosive forces in our human psyche. So I think it's really important always to remain humble, also to be grateful and thankful for what we have instead of focusing on what the problems are or what we may want. So for me, in addition to finding common ground and building from there as an advocate, I also like to focus on the positive and the things that I can do and really dwell in that instead of focusing on the things that upset me. And, it's the Serenity Prayer, right? To give me the strength to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So to me, that's a big part of continuing to do this work and to keep things in perspective and to recognize that we're all human beings trying to do the best we can with a number of challenges and limitations. We all have these, and so just that, I think, keeps you humble, that we're just all part of this bigger picture and none of us is perfect. That's another very important thing. And so judging others for making mistakes is not usually that healthy. I mean, and I'm really a big fan of the idea of love the sinner, hate the sin. So again, this gets into the principles as opposed to the persons, right? If there's something happening that somebody is doing that is harmful, you talk about that instead of attacking the person. So to me, that's also very important.
Yeah, I like the Serenity Prayer too. For some reason, it always relaxes me whenever I read it or say it.
Yeah.
So how has your fame and increasing prominence over the years affected your close personal and or professional relationships that others can learn from?
Well, I think always, no matter how well somebody is known or not known, the same principles apply, right? Just kindness. Try to be as kind as you can to everybody. Take care of yourself. I mean, I think that's another important principle. Get enough sleep, drink enough water, exercise. And that will allow a person to have a healthier perspective, whereas if somebody is running too fast and stressing themselves out, there is going to be tendencies to make some mistakes and to lose some perspective, I think. So just taking care of yourself, self-love is important. And again, focus on the positive, focus on what you can do, being heartened by the good things that are happening, and try not to get too upset about the bad things. We can't ignore the bad things. We cannot close our eyes, but I don't think it's healthy to dwell in those.
Yeah, that seems almost too simple, Jean. So self-care and will help you tackle the stress or the blind spots of fame. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Self-care and humility. and recognizing that we are all human beings and we're all trying to do the best we can, and none of us is perfect, including ourselves. So part of self-care is not being too hard on yourself. I mean, pushing yourself, but not beating yourself up, and being around people also that help you to be your best self, right? To push yourself, but not too much, right? So that's a balance. All this is a balance.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very nuanced thing for sure. So I know you co-founded Farm Sanctuary with your former spouse, Lori. What would you have done differently with Farm Sanctuary, legally and professionally, if you knew you two were going to split in the future? What preparations would you have made ahead of time to make this transition process easier?
Those are very hard questions, because you get into something and you just go day to day to day to day, and then things evolve, and then circumstances change, and then you respond to those situations. So it's very hard to predict what the future holds. And so I think doing the best you can in each moment is important, and recognizing that each action you take has longer term consequences, whatever they might be. But if you're acting from a place of love and kindness, I think that ultimately things are going to work out in a positive way. So with Lori and I, when we started Farm Sanctuary back in the mid 1980s, we were both pretty young, kind of, I don't want to say angry activists, but really go get them kind of activists. And that's a kind of energy that is sometimes very useful when an organization is beginning. But as something grows, you then also need to have structures in place. And so being mindful of the structures, and then being very thoughtful about how to create structures that are going to be sustainable and healthy. And that is something that, we didn't really understand as Farm Sanctuary began. And we're actually now doing an awful lot of very good work at the organization to put structures in place. And some of this stuff is basic, having a database that works for a membership list, right? I mean, basic stuff. And, but then also having, an organizational structure and clear roles that different individuals are supposed to play. And you just have to be intentional about that. And in some cases, getting, professional folks involved who know what a nonprofit organization is supposed to look like. As organizations grow and become bigger, things change. So you want to hold on to the heart of it. You want to hold on to the mission of it. But when you have a bigger platform, you have bigger opportunities, but you have to do things a little differently sometimes.
Exactly. Thank you for that very insightful response. So I know you've traveled extensively doing farm animal advocacy work, at least all around the U.S. So where have you traveled to, out of curiosity, either domestically or internationally? And which country had the best practice in terms of treatment of farm animals that we can start learning here in the U.S.?
Well, I have primarily traveled in the US when it comes to focusing on animal agriculture and the systems here. So those are the ones I'm most familiar with. I have been to some farms in France. And in Europe, it seems that the farms tend to be smaller than in the US, and in some cases less industrialized, although there are certainly industrial farms in Europe and in other parts of the world. But I think that in addition to the agriculture system, which unfortunately animal agriculture has a very strong desire to basically colonize the planet and to, implement these kinds of industrial methods around the world. And US foreign policy and trade agreements very much promote this idea, unfortunately. But besides the production stuff, there's the consumption side of things. And I think that is where there's great opportunity around the world to encourage people to recognize that animal agriculture causes enormous harm, and that eating plants instead of animals makes more sense for ourselves, for animals, and the earth. And I've traveled and spoken in parts of Scandinavia, I've spoken in other parts of Europe. I've spoken in South America. And in each of these places, it seems that there's a budding interest in vegan living. There are vegan businesses, there are vegan activists. And in my mind, that is very positive. And I think that that is a very positive place to focus. While we're also trying to change government policies and systems and structures that promote animal agriculture, consumers and cultures also play a big role in what is considered to be acceptable. But there are champions for plant-based living around the world, and I think those folks need to be supported. In the US, with growing recognition of our systemic racism, there are also, I think, enormous opportunities in certain communities to support efforts to promote plant-based food. You know, there have been Black vegan activists in the US since the 1960s, you know, that I and other white vegan activists are just starting to learn about. So I think there's an awful lot of energy and awareness about these issues that we need to understand and support. And I think that process is ongoing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think when people think of vegan, they often think of white people, and they often think of white men, and then white women. So to keep in mind that, you know, it's vegans can be anybody. Anybody can, you know, come on board and live a healthy, sustainable life.
Absolutely.
So I saw that, speaking of Black vegans, I saw that, you know, Farm Sanctuary put out a statement on Black Lives Matter, you know, on that whole issue. How do you keep updated on other important social news and make people feel valued and heard while mainly focusing on your mission, and not get distracted by other urgent social issues? So having that balance of what's important to other people and what's important to you as well.
Yes. Well, again, I go back to the find common ground and build from there, right? An aspiration to live as kindly as possible and to prevent systems of oppression, right? And there's an awful lot of common ground, I believe, with, you know, with using this vegan perspective and speaking to people where they are on their own journeys as well, and working to end systems of oppression. So often, you know, people who are exploited in agriculture are people of color. You know, these slaughterhouses now where people are getting sick and dying, you know, are places of enormous injustice. And most of the slaughterhouse owners are white, and most of the people who work there are people of color. So there's something there that has to be exposed and addressed. And so for me, a large part of this is about learning more and then figuring out how to play the most positive role at advancing our shared concerns and our shared interests. You know, for years, Farm Sanctuary has had some interest in this. We worked with Tracy McWhorter to do the African American Vegan Starter Guide a couple of years ago. She wrote the book By Any Means Necessary. She's been an African American vegan activist for decades and continues doing really great work. So supporting folks like Tracy and others who've done good work already, and just trying to understand more what we can do to support, you know, good work that's already happening. So part of this really is listening and learning and trying to understand, and then figuring out where is the common ground and where are the opportunities to advance our shared interests.
Yeah, do you know any vegan individuals with disabilities in the movement?
There's a woman, I think her name is Gretchen, who lives in California, who's in a wheelchair. I know her. Not very many. And that is something that I think that we can do much better with.
Yeah, maybe I'll come on board.
Yeah. No, it's part of this growing process. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel guilty interviewing you when my family's vegetarian and then you're vegan and Jean's vegan. Feel out of place here.
Look, we're all works in progress. We're all works in progress, right? There's things that I need to learn too and do better with.
Thank you. So last question. Thank you for being so obliging. So if the issue of animal cruelty was resolved today, what else would you do as a career choice?
Very interesting question. I would love to see that happen. I don't imagine it's going to, but I mean, I could see myself just living on a veganic farm somewhere, you know, being in nature, being near beautiful natural places, and trying to live on the planet in a way that is mutually beneficial with the earth and with other creatures. I mean, that to me is the ultimate goal. And how do we create that? I don't know. But just living in a beautiful place and enjoying nature to me is really inspiring. And also sharing that and trying to inspire and support others in living in a way that is kind and that is mutual, right? As opposed to how we as humans have tended to live, which is exploitive and extractive. So creating mutuality is to me the goal. And so when you're living in a beautiful place, I could see art, I could see, again, just living beautiful that's what I would love to see happen.
That's awesome. I think you're idealist. A lot of the visions you paint are very idyllic. I love
I'm
it.
definitely an idealist. I'm definitely a dreamer. And
Um,
I keep hope. I always have hope, you know, despite what I sometimes see.
yeah, no, and your background matches, a lot of things in common with my family for sure. So my brother is an ultra marathon racer professionally, and I see
Wow.
that you do marathons and Ironmans and ultras. So,
Yes.
and he went to Cornell as well. He and
Yes.
his girlfriend are vegans and are big fans of yours.
That's great.
We're doing amazing work for decades and decades. I think it's always great to speak to people who've been with the movement for so long, whatever movement they choose, and stick with it for the long haul. Because it's one thing to be passionate and righteous about it for a few years, but it's another to be there for a few decades, and you see the different seasons of it.
Yeah, well, it's been a very interesting evolution in our movement, which is continuing to evolve. And I am hopeful that it will become more impactful, more diverse, more inclusive, and play a bigger role in creating a kinder world. That's ultimately what I hope for.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely on the right track in doing that. And thank you so much for keeping people with disabilities in mind as well in the movement. And there are 1 billion of us, and just being inclusive, whether that be infrastructurally or attitudes or employment or whatnot. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Absolutely. It's very important.
Jean
Thank you
Mishner,
for the
did you have
opportunity.
anything in closing?
No, keep up the great work. We love following it, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Did you like this video? If so, share with your friends and be sure to follow us on social media. And if you want even more resources, be sure to sign up for our email updates on our website, traipsingglobal.com. Keep learning new perspectives, keep being inclusive, because it will make the world a better place for you and for everyone else. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on another episode of the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour.